Is that, what does that mean if you record it, that we could see it at another time or review it?
Yeah, I guess so. It'll be saved with our Zoom account with the church.
I would just go to AWC Live then.
I will, Jill or Lee sent me instructions yesterday about how to retrieve the recording. I've never done that,
Okay.
but I'll follow up on that.
Yeah, because that's nice to go back, and if you miss something, you didn't understand something, to go back over it.
Certainly. Yeah. Okay. Well, the appointed hour is here. Oh, we have one more addition in the waiting room. Hold on just a minute. It's about time for us to start. We're going to add Ashlyn Note.
Hi.
Hi, Ashlyn.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Is Ashlyn on? Awesome.
Yeah. She has to, oh, there she goes. Hello.
Ashlyn, hello.
How are you doing?
Oh,
Hey, Mike.
Hi, Mike.
All right.
All right. And Ashlyn, Mike, I think you know all but one face on the screen. Is that a good guess?
Yes.
that's a test. That's your first quiz.
That's my sister Barb in Illinois.
Oh,
Ashlyn, you're high school homeschooling. What year are you in high school this year?
14.
No.
I'm in 11th grade, so junior year.
Okay. Good job. Bill's waving something in the background.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Jill is trying to break in too, Jimmy.
Oh, okay. I'm not watching the waiting room. There you go, Jill. We will let you in.
She gets to have her own screen.
Her own screen.
Even though we're sitting next to each other, but we're listening on earphones.
Oh, that's a better way to hear.
Yeah, it's good.
All right. There could be others joining us, but no one's in the waiting room. So I think we'll get this going. It's 3 minutes after. I think everybody's up to speed now on the class schedule. We've got class this morning and then 2 more Thursday mornings, the 12th and the 19th of November. And still greeting everybody. We can't hear.
I think she's greeting Barb.
Have an unruly class.
Yeah.
You're going to use the very same link you used this morning for Thursday morning, the 12th, Thursday morning, the 19th. Is everybody good on that?
Mm-hmm.
Understand the logistics there? Great. If you really like the class, of course, you can take it again this evening at 7. Why you would do that, I don't know, but I'll be doing the same class again.
I may do that in a couple of weeks when I go up to Glenwood, because I'll be taking care of the baby and
Right.
at this time. So it will be better for me to probably do the 7 o'clock in the evening. So I will probably do that.
Sit in on either class, whatever's most convenient for you.
Okay. See,
Time-wise.
Zoom is great.
The
God is good.
evening class, of course, has a different link, which you saw in the email.
Uh-huh.
So we have just 1, 2, 5, 7 students here. That's a modestly sized group. I think what I'm going to try today is to leave everybody unmuted. And because we're kind of a small group, only 7. So let's try that. In just a moment, we'll get started. I'm going to share my screen. I assume you all have your handouts available. Wonderful. And so what I'm showing on the screen is going to be really tiny, but I'll use that to show you where I am on the timeline, and hopefully the oversized handout will be easier for you to read and to follow. As I said, I think for now, I'm going to leave everyone online audio, and let's take questions and answers as we go. And let's see how that works, okay? All right, I'm going to share my screen. Just takes a couple clicks. And we're going to launch into...
I have a question, Jim.
Sure.
If while you're talking, something occurs to us, can we put something in the chat room? Can we put a question in the chat room? Or
You know, I'm not planning to be watching that. So if it were a larger group and I muted everybody, we might use that. But Barb, let's not go there this morning. We're kind of a small group, okay?
Yep.
I assume the first slide's up. You can see it.
Yep.
All right. I think that's all we need to do to get us started. So let's go here. I want to start with a little nomenclature just to make sure we're all clear. We all are familiar with the naming of the two major eras of human history: before Christ, BC, and AD, in the year of our Lord. But I thought I'd just look at this briefly to make sure everybody's clear on the terminology. AD is not after death, which I thought once upon a time. It means in the year of our Lord, from the Latin Anno Domini, which itself is a shortened version of Anno Domini Nostri Jesu Christi. Now, I'm really glad we use the abbreviation, because think how awkward it would be to say in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ 2020, every time you need to declare what year it is. So the abbreviation is quite helpful. This dividing of the eras of human history was an idea that originated over 1,500 years ago. And it's not even clear. The idea was to put Christ's advent in year 1. And it's not even clear if that meant the year of his birth or the date of his conception, 9 months before the birth. So that isn't even clear in what was intended originally. On this timeline, I want you to see that I've got 4 years here: 2 BC, 1 BC, AD 1, AD 2. There's no year 0 in this conception of history. So that's kind of helpful to know. Time went from 1 BC to AD 1. Now, I've also noted here that there's 2 other acronyms to label these 2 eras: BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, the Common Era. And I used to kind of bristle at these politically correct descriptions of the eras. Why not stick with the traditional BC and AD? I guess I've gotten more comfortable with it because non-Christian scholars, academics, Jewish scholars, Muslim scholars, secular scholars, it's a little perhaps arrogant for us to expect that they're going to declare in the year of our Lord every time they name an era of history. So I don't know about you, I've gotten a little more comfortable with that. Another thing I learned is that the abbreviation AD is properly used as a prefix, as in AD 2020. And the acronyms BC, CE, and BCE are used properly as suffixes, as in 2020 CE. So a slight difference there.
Jimmy, I thought that BC was before Christ. Is that
Yeah,
not BCE or CE, but BC specifically?
I've got it labeled.
Yeah, but he didn't say that. So,
Oh, I'm sorry. I did.
so
Okay. The next thing I wanted to do was talk about how centuries get named. Again, I don't know about you, but this has been a bit confusing for me. I'm getting used to it, but here's 3 recent centuries in this central timeline. And the question is, what do we call the middle century? And in fact, there are 2 very different ways of labeling that middle century. The label in blue is to call it the 1700s. And you'll note how this is keyed to the number 17. And in my mind, it kind of points back to the beginning of the century. The other common naming convention is 18th century. Well, that is keyed to the number 18. And in my mind, it points to the end of the century. And I found over time, I've had to always stop and think, now, which century is this? Is we talking about the beginning or the ending? Is the 1700s? Okay, that's the same thing as the 18th century, even though it uses a different numerical designation. I'll probably use both of those conventions as we go along here.
Jimmy, that's consistent with year 1 being the first year and the 18th century being starting in the 1700s.
Mm-hmm. Correct. This naming convention is a tad confusing when we go to the earlier era before Christ. And here's an example. Here's a timeline of 3 centuries BC, and I've labeled the middle century. But notice what happens. The blue label with the 700s, that now points toward the end of the century, not the beginning. And the green label, 8th century BC, that now points toward the beginning of the century. So everything is inverted when we get into the years BC. So hopefully this distinction can be a little helpful, and that's how these centuries will get named in the nomenclature I'll be using. All right, let's go to page 2 of your handout, and we're going to take a walk through the timeline together. This timeline, I'm going to begin with Abraham. And God made a covenant with Abraham. You can read about it in Genesis 12. He says, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. So this is beginning of this nation of Israel. And God also declared, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. We Christians believe that's pointing ahead in time to Christ the Messiah. So the story of the people of Israel begins here with Abraham, and that's where I'm going to start the timeline. Real quickly, hold on, let me turn on my pointer. I forgot to do that. All right, here we go. So on this page, we've got this black bar right here, which is the beginning, and time is running forward chronologically all the way up to the year 722 over here. And then it continues on this bottom timeline and continues through to the time of Christ, the apostolic period, and basically the 1st century AD. So that's the time period we're going to cover. Let's start with Abraham. The nation of Israel begins with Abraham. His son, who received the covenant, was Isaac, and the covenant passed from Isaac then to Jacob. The creators of this timeline put Job in the middle. I would have preferred to see Isaac right here, but we'll work with that. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the next major event on the timeline is that Jacob and his family encounter a famine. Joseph, the youngest son, has been sold into slavery in Egypt, and God uses Joseph's success in Egypt to provide a refuge and a rescue from the famine. So Jacob and his entire clan, only 70 people we read, moved to Egypt and reside there in Egypt for the next 430 years. And that's that gray little triangle above the timeline, about 430 years. Of course,
can I interrupt just for a second?
Sure.
You've got the dates there, pretty specific dates, like 2165 BC. Where do those dates come from? And how
Sure.
reliable are they?
Let's talk about dates. Lee, they aren't exact. And when you look at different sources, you get different dates. Sometimes the dates are off by a year or two, sometimes they're off by centuries. So here's a good example here. Notice they have Job, they've got a 200-year period. Well, honestly, we don't really know when the story of Job takes place. We have no clue. Another example, Lee, is right here. The Exodus is shown in the year 1446. The creators of this particular timeline apparently were using the generations described in the Bible, the ages of each of the individuals, and you can at least approximate a timeline, and I'm pretty sure that's where the 1446 comes from. Among scholars, the dating of the Exodus is actually 200 years later. And the reason for that is that the place names in Egypt that we read in the Bible, that fits better with the Egyptian history 2 centuries later. So Lee, the Exodus here is in the 15th century BC. Most historians put the Exodus in the 13th century BC. So we're talking a 200-year uncertainty. So as we go through this, be flexible. There are uncertainties in almost every date. As we get closer, as we get later in time, the dates become much tighter. Some of them we know exact years. As we start here at the very beginning of the timeline, we've got to exercise a little flexibility. There's a lot of uncertainty as to the exact dates. Does that help?
Sure.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Good question. That's really a key question. Well, after the Exodus here, the next period by this little upside down hat is the 40 years wandering in the wilderness. At the end of that period, Moses' life comes to an end. Leadership passes to Joshua, who then leads the conquest of Canaan. The very famous images here is the people of Israel crossing the Jordan and going into the promised land. And Joshua's in the lead, and that opens up the era of the judges. About a nearly 300-year period where the people of Israel live as 12 independent tribes, as you were, but related to each other. They aren't unified as a nation. They don't have a central government. They don't have a capital city. They don't have a king. And different judges rise up over periods of time to settle disputes and to provide leadership when the people of Israel are threatened. One thing I'd like to make a note of is that we might ask what, Lee, this kind of ties to your question, how certain are these dates? A related question is there any evidence outside the Bible that these events and these events happened, did this nation of Israel really exist? This is not in your notes, but I want to draw our attention to the period of the Judges, because the earliest archaeological evidence of Israel's existence occurs during this period. And that evidence is dated pretty precisely to 1208 or 09 BC. And the artifact is called the Merneptah stele. This is in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. A stele is a large flat stone inscribed with some kind of graphic or lettering. This one's written in hieroglyphics. You can see when it was discovered. It's pretty reasonably dated to 08, 09 because it commemorates some warfare between Egypt and neighboring Libya to the west. And historians have a pretty good idea who the pharaoh was and when that battle occurred. What's notable about this artifact is that it contains the earliest known occurrence of the word Israel. It's written in Egyptian hieroglyphics, and it refers to neighboring peoples, neighbors to Egypt to the northeast. And among the peoples who are listed is the people of Israel. So this is a pretty interesting little point in time. We have confirmation that the people of Israel existed right there in the middle of the period of the Judges. It fits the biblical story. Another little detail is that the hieroglyphics have a word that denotes a nation, and they have a word that denotes a people or an ethnic group. And the word used for Israel describes a people, an ethnic group, not a nation. Again, that fits the biblical story for this period of time. All right, let's move ahead. The period of the Judges comes to a close when the people are longing for a king. God calls the prophet Samuel, and he anoints Saul as king and later David. And David is followed on the throne by his son Solomon. This is the period of a united kingdom of Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon. This is a period of about 120 years from when Saul is anointed to Solomon's death in 931. And this is kind of a golden age for Israel. Israel becomes, it occupies a larger territory, and it becomes a pretty wealthy kingdom at this time. Solomon is described as being the wisest and wealthiest king of his era, which is really a remarkable thing. And we'll talk about that some more in weeks 2 and 3. So really kind of a golden era, about 120 years of united kingdom of Israel. Upon Solomon's death in 931 BC, there's competition for the throne. 2 of Solomon's sons claim the throne. The 12 tribes of Israel divide behind those 2 sons, and the whole kingdom splits into 2. So 2 of the tribes stick with the southern kingdom, which goes by the name Judah, and 10 of the tribes unite to form a northern kingdom called Israel. The next thing on our timeline is a couple hundred years later. I'm going to pass Jonah for the moment, and we see the prophet Isaiah here. We'll talk about him some more as well. But the most momentous thing that happens is about 250, about 200 years later, after the kingdoms divide, a neighboring empire called Assyria comes down from the north, invades Israel, conquers Israel, and they forcibly deport, remove most of the population of Israel. They take those people back into Assyria and forcibly assimilate them into the Assyrian Empire, which is in Mesopotamia. We'll look at a map, and as we go along here, I'll talk further about that. The Assyrians not only conquer Israel, but this deportation and this forced assimilation into the Assyrian Empire, it results in those 10 tribes of Israel essentially ceasing to exist as Hebrew people. They lose their language, they lose their religion, they're probably end up intermarrying with the Assyrian peoples, so they lose their ethnic identity. And those 10 tribes disappear from history, as it were. They're often referred to as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And you've probably heard that description before. Okay, let me move ahead in my notes here. One moment. Okay, so that obviously is a really pivotal event. And the surviving kingdom is Judah, based in Jerusalem. All right, I'm going to keep going down here, and we'll start on the bottom timeline. Things go better for Judah for a while, but it's only about a century later. We can see the prophet Jeremiah is active in speaking to the kingdom of Judah. But then another empire, also out of Mesopotamia, sweeps in from the northeast and endangers Judah. And we see here in the year 605, Babylon conquers Judah, and Daniel and his companions are taken into exile in Judah. Now, on this timeline, it's interesting because it then shows the 70 years of exile. And I think this timeline is a little misleading the way they've displayed it here, because the collision between Babylon and Judah It's not a simple event. When Assyria invaded Israel back in 722, I think that was a pretty sudden calamitous event. I think it all took place in one continuous action. But when Babylon confronts Judah, it's a series of confrontations over a couple of decades. And there wasn't a single deportation that this timeline seems to imply in 605. There were waves of deportation over at least a 20-year period. We know that Babylon came into Judah in the year 605. They returned and besieged Jerusalem again in 598. And then there was a third siege of Jerusalem in the year 587. Those dates are not on your timeline, but it was 587 that was most climactic, because at that time, the Babylonian army broke through the walls of Jerusalem. They conquered and devastated the whole city, and they burned the temple. And most historians date the destruction of the temple to the year 586. And you can see that's a full 20 years after the time that Daniel was taken into exile. So there's some real complex things going on here, but the general idea is that Babylon came in and over a period of time exiled a significant part of the Jewish population to exile in Babylon. That comes to a momentous ending in the year 539. That's right here. So Babylon meets a quick end when an empire further east, Persia, invades, and the city of Babylon falls in 539. Speaking of dates, this date I think is pretty well set, because there's a lot of known history of both Babylon and Persia, and I think that's a date that's pretty solid. And a really remarkable thing happens. The king of Persia is a guy named Cyrus. The very next year, he issues a remarkable proclamation that the Jews would be allowed to return to their homeland. And we'll spend some more time talking about this as well. Cyrus was really a unique character. He had very benevolent policies toward exiled people, conquered peoples. And it was nothing like that had occurred before in human history, at least here in the ancient Middle East. All conquering empires, they extracted wealth and they brought people into their empire to build up their workforce. Here you have Cyrus, who's encouraging people to return to their homelands. And not only that, he gives permission that a temple will be constructed, rebuilt in Jerusalem. And we'll talk more about that too. That temple rebuilding is finished according to this timeline, 515. I've also seen the date 516. And here's how I think about the 70 years in exile. I've already noted how the deportations to exile occurred over at least 2 decades in several waves of deportation. In the same way, the return from exile did not occur at just one time. It occurred in waves over many decades. So Cyrus issues the decree to permit a return in 538. But look at this, way over here, a century later, 458, you've got Ezra leading a group of Jews back to Israel. So again, it's not a single discrete event. It's Jews returning in different waves over many, many decades. What I do see, though, I've already told you that the temple was destroyed back here, we think in the year 586. The Jews actually claim to know the month and the day when the temple was burned. The rebuilding of the temple was completed, I think, in 516, and that's exactly 70 years from the date it was burned. And my guess is that the biblical 70 years of exile may refer to the 70 years when there was no consecrated temple in existence where the Jews could worship and meet with God. So that's certainly an idea that's pretty interesting, because there is an exact 70-year period in there. After the Jews return, by the way, Esther is a story of the Jews in Babylon, and they receive protection from the current king of Persia in the story of Esther. Fascinating story. Ezra returns in the 5th century BC, calls the Jews back to obedience to the law. Nehemiah returns in the same century and leads a rebuilding of the city walls that Babylon had destroyed back in probably in the year 587, 586. More than 100 years earlier, Jerusalem becomes a fortified city again. And in the same century, we have the last Old Testament prophet, Malachi. And this brings to a close the prophetic period. In fact, we'll talk more about this again, but the prophetic period opens up here with Jonah and Isaiah about the 8th century BC, and it closes with Malachi in the 5th century BC. So we've got about a 300-year period, and all of the major and minor prophets are active during this period. Well, Jerusalem is rebuilt. Jews are living in Jerusalem once again. The second temple has been completed. It's in use, and the Jews have an existence within the Persian Empire. That changes dramatically around the year 323. Oh, no, let me go here, 331. Over a period of 3 or 4 years, Alexander the Great, a Greek king, a very young Greek king, marches out of Greece and he conquers the entire Persian Empire. Now, this is an absolutely remarkable period of history because Persia is the largest empire that has existed in the entire history of the Middle East to date. And Greece is a pretty small nation in comparison, but under Alexander's leadership, they defeat every Persian army that they encounter. There's several battles over several years. Alexander fights in Egypt. He fights in current day Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Alexander gets all the way to the Indus River, which is the border between modern day Pakistan and India. He covers an enormous area, subdues the entire Persian Empire, and it becomes a Greek empire. And so now Judah falls under Greek control. Following Alexander's death, by the way, he dies in 323. Again, that's a date known pretty reliably. And the area where Judah exists becomes part of what's called the Seleucid Empire. It's a remnant of this Persian Empire now under Greek control by a dynasty called the Seleucids. So Judah is now under Greek domination. Well, that's not a very comfortable time for the Jews because Greeks are pretty aggressive in pushing their culture upon all the parts of the world that they had conquered. And Greek thought and Jewish religious thought are not highly compatible. It reaches a head around this period, 165. The Greeks are really offended by the Jewish worship in the temple, and they actually barge in and perform some sacrifices to a Greek god in the Jewish temple. A Jew named Judas Maccabeus becomes so angry he leads an armed revolt, and it's a 7-year uprising by the Jewish people, mostly a guerrilla warfare action. And surprisingly, this Maccabean revolt is successful, and they're able to obtain substantial independence and to throw off Greek control. This begins about a century-long period from 165 to 63, where the Jews have a great degree of independence. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a coming class as well. It's not an entirely peaceful period for the Jews because Jewish culture is still wrestling with this conflict of Jewish ways versus Greek ways. And there's mixed opinions about that within the Jewish nation. It's a bloody period. There's civil wars. It's not a golden age by any means for the Jews. Eventually, this weakened kingdom comes under Roman control in the year 63, and a King Herod rises to the throne in the year 37. And that's momentous. This is the Herod we know of from the period when Christ was born. We now come into the New Testament period. One thing you'll note is even though the naming of the eras of human history was intended to put Christ's birth in the year 1 AD, most scholars think Christ was born a few years BC. We don't know exactly when. The dates I see most often are 4 BC or 6 BC. And I read just this week that King Herod died in the year 4 BC. Well, Herod was the king who met with the wise men and sent them to Bethlehem. So Jesus' birth very likely was 5 or 6 BC. It's reasonable anyway. And Herod was the one who ordered the murder, the killing of all infant boys in Bethlehem 2 years age or younger. So it really, the evidence points to Christ being born 5, 6 BC, somewhere in there. Again, we don't know the date exactly when he was crucified. This timeline estimates the period 30 to 33. Approximately, we don't know for sure. Following Christ's resurrection and ascension into heaven, you have about a 30-year period, which we could call the early church or the apostolic period. Most of the New Testament is written during this time, with the book of Revelation, we think, being written late in the 1st century, around the year 95. And that closes out the writing of the New Testament. I want to finish today by highlighting 2 really traumatic events that are important in the story of Israel. And the first one's right here. The only thing in the timeline is the year AD 70, when Rome conquers Jerusalem and destroys the second temple, the Jewish temple that Jesus knew. In fact, this destruction of the temple is part of what's called the First Jewish War. It lasts for 7 years. It starts in the year 66, and it's not concluded until the year 73, when the fortress Masada falls to the Romans. But the single most momentous event is in the year 70, Rome breaks through the walls of Jerusalem, captures all of Jerusalem, and destroys the temple. It's a bloody period. Probably tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Jews are carried off into slavery. The Roman Empire was a slave economy, and slaves were highly valued. That was probably the fate of many Jews at this period of time. The Romans systematically dismantled the temple. And that was the end of Jewish worship in the temple right here in 70 AD. This was not the last armed revolt against Jewish rule. So off your timeline to the right, I'm going to highlight one event in the 2nd century. The next Jewish revolt against Rome was it's either called the Second Jewish War of Independence or the Bar Kokhba revolt. Maybe you've heard that name. Kokhba is K-O-K-H-B-A, the Bar Kokhba revolt. It too was a multi-year military action in the years 132 to 136. And once again, as you might imagine, the Jews were lost to the Roman Empire. It was bloody. At the conclusion of the Bar Kokhba revolt, some really important things happened that set the course for the Jewish people. In fact, for the next 2,000 years. Rome is so ticked at the Jews by this time. Multiple violent rebellions against Roman rule over the past century. Rome sets out to erase, essentially, the Jewish homeland. For one, an edict is issued that Jews can no longer even set foot in Jerusalem. Not only are they forbidden to live there, they can't even set foot. They're allowed 1 day a year, a day of mourning, where Jews can visit Jerusalem. That's it. Jerusalem is off limits. Another thing Rome does is that they rename the city and the area. So Jerusalem is a Hebrew name. That is taken away, and they give it a Latin name, Aelia Capitolina. So the city is renamed. Judah itself is renamed. Instead of Judah, Rome renames it Syria Palestina. Now that should be a word that catches your attention. The name Palestine is our version of Syria Palestina. That name has come down to the 20th century and even here into the 21st century. These actions by Rome really minimized the ability of the Jews to return to and live in their homeland. And for the next 2,000 years, in fact, they have lived in places all over the world, almost every continent, I think, except for Antarctica. There are Jewish communities. They've been a people living in dispersion, in diaspora. the actions taken by the Romans following this Bar Kokhba revolt were monumental and basically set the course for the Jewish people for the next 2,000 years. All right, we're getting close to the end of our hour. I think I'm going to pause here. And let's open it up for some question and answer, perhaps.
Ooh.
I covered a lot of ground. You guys have been excellent listeners. I appreciate it. What do you think?
I think this was very interesting. I've been watching a few videos about the timelines with when the Jews were leaving Egypt during the
Exodus.
Exodus. Thank you, Austrian. Yeah, during the Exodus, and they were talking about how the timeline was set too late, that it really needs to be set back 100 years, just as you were referring to. So it was like, oh, okay, now that makes sense. And so, there's a lot of things that are starting to kind of pull together for me as to why things were happening at that time and what caused something else to happen. The Maccabees, that's the other one, is the period of the Maccabees. That was a period that the Jews now call, what is it? Something about the lights, Hanukkah. Is that Hanukkah?
You're right, Donna. The celebration of Hanukkah comes from the liberation of Jerusalem and the temple during the Maccabees revolt. And one of the first things they wanted to do when they drove the Greeks from Jerusalem is relight the menorah, the 7-flame menorah in the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And they had very little olive oil. They didn't think it would keep the menorah burning through the festival. And it did. Miraculously, the menorah didn't go out, and that became that celebration of the lights. You're right. So that was a rapid 2,000 years. What we'll do in the next 2 classes is I'm going to overlay various events and themes from history. You already probably have a flavor of this from looking ahead in the timelines in your handout. And we'll talk about how those different aspects of history give us a richer context for this 2,000 years of the people of Israel. And I hope as well kind of give you guys a roadmap. So in the future, when you're reading an Old Testament story about Daniel or Joseph or Joshua, you'll have a richer context in the sense of how that story was shaped by the events taking place in the larger ancient Middle East.
I've just been learning in my Old Testament class about how the first 5 books of the Bible were put together during that Babylonian exile. And they pieced that together as hope for the Israelites. And I just think that's so cool that even, we can see different things going on through history for how all of it was put together and how we have what we believe.
Sarah, I've been reading about that too. It gave hope to the people in exile and a unique identity and dignity, because the biblical creation story gives much more valuable to humans than the Babylonian creation stories. That's a fascinating topic in itself. Anybody else? Are you all numbed by 2,000 years of time travel?
I think one thing that looking at this whole big timeline, that the only, the point of the kingdom, that it's a whole kingdom between Saul and Solomon was that's it, before they were divided. It's just such a short time.
That's true, Ellie. It was a pretty surprisingly short 120 years out of the a longer story.
Mhm.
Yeah, it just really, just seeing it on the timeline is really good. It's very short.
Yep.
Mm.
So who do you think were the ones that were writing the books, the first books of the Bible? The, what is that, the Torah, the Talmud, or whatever they do call that, the first 5 books. Who was that was doing that in that period of time when they were in exile?
Sarah, did your seminary class speak to that at all?
Well, it was compiled by a lot of different people because they had oral tradition. And I believe during that time is when Josiah found the scrolls. I don't know if I'm right on that, but and then wanted the people to go back to following God, and so they put it together. I think I've got that part right, but yeah, so they don't know exactly who wrote it all. They believe Moses came up with a lot of it. Although, like at the end of Deuteronomy, it talks about how Moses died. So they're like, obviously, he couldn't have written that. So it's just a lot of different people. But so neat that God can work in that and give us the word that we need.
Yes. And just
the
heard
Pentateuch.
too about that being done during that time. And so it makes so much more sense when you think about, well, yeah, it wasn't just written by Moses. It wasn't just written by somebody else while Moses was living. It was actually a period of time where it was written. And then the scrolls were evidently put away because then Josiah found them later. And the people hadn't even heard these things. And so they opened up their minds and their hearts to what the scrolls were saying. So that really fits in with what my thinking was, as to why and how it was all written, those first 5 books. I mean, it seems, yeah, we know it's oral tradition and we can say, yeah, it's oral tradition, but then we do have a backup with testaments or we have the scrolls. And those were the ones that the Jewish people rolled up and they put into seclusion and kept so safe, and they still do today. They put it away in a very little special place. And even when they fled a city, they would take the scrolls with them because they were so precious.
Yeah, I think some people traditionally ascribe the writing of the Pentateuch, most of the Pentateuch, to Moses, but even in early Genesis, there are differences in language and some
Good point.
discrepancies in details that suggest that it was multiple writers who were even at the beginning. But as you said, Donna, it was an oral tradition. And so when it was actually written down, it was probably multiple people accumulating the oral tradition. And the Torah includes the Psalms, and I can't remember whether it includes Proverbs or not. Yeah. So there's the Pentateuch, and then there's the Torah, which is the thing that is revered and hidden in the holy places in the temple But that includes the Psalms and Proverbs.
Well, guys, all these dimensions of the mystery, really, about when did these books first get written down? How long were they oral tradition? When did they get written? Who wrote them? These are all the, I've wrestled with all the same things, and it's a bit mysterious. We don't know exactly. So you guys, I think you're tracking pretty well on the same things.
I'm excited.
Wonderful.
I'm excited to know more, just because I want to be able to share this with others when they come and ask me questions. And well, how can you know that this was written by Moses? And how can you know this? I don't know. And that's just the thing. I do know that we have scrolls that were found. I do know that. But as far as who wrote them, I never know who wrote them. But this makes more sense to me, thinking about that there were numbers of people that probably participated in this event, and that they were doing this during the Babylonian exile makes even more sense, because they were trying to create a history to be able to pass on to their children, basically. It was a time of hope, to give them hope that they would have that, and that it's still a thing of hope. All of that is still a part of the Jewish tradition, and it is still part of their hope. It is very important to them.
Two elements that were really important to the identity of the Hebrew people. One was the land, the promised land, and another was the temple.
Mm-hmm.
In the midst of the Babylonian exile, they lost both the land and the temple. So it was a period of great anguish and questioning their identity. So having a clear identity rooted in their 2,000-year history, going back to the Pentateuch, 5 books of Moses and all that, it was really a critical time to rebuild some hope and identity. Well, guys, thank you very much. We're just a little after 10. Thanks for your attentiveness, excellent questions and conversation. We've got some really interesting things to add on top of this basic timeline in the coming 2 weeks. And I'm going to talk about oral history versus written history, oral history versus modern history. I'm going to talk about the different empires, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and how those encounters with those empires affected Israel. I'm going to call it the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we've got some really interesting ground to cover. And again, I hope it'll give you a richer context in which to study and learn and read the Old Testament. Well, guys, I think I'll wrap up the class here. The Zoom meeting is live for another half hour, if anyone wants to hang around and visit. And I look forward to seeing you again next week. This is fun. I have fun doing this, and I hope your time has been well spent.
Thank you, Jim.
Good job, Jimmy.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Barb.
I appreciate the work that you've put into this.
This is what I'm doing in retirement. I'm just fascinated by reading about this.
Oh, isn't it fun?
It is.
God is good.
Ellen wondering, what am I doing?
All the time.
I'm reading all this stuff.
Spends a lot of time.
Barb, good to see you. Are they in the field today? Is it good weather back there?
Yes, we have beautiful weather. We've had a great stretch of harvest, and actually they're in the last field today. So it's looking good.
Barb, literally the last field today. Oh, that's good.
Wow.
First week in November. That's a good time to be finishing. So
Mark, can I have a tour of your revitalized house after the fire?
Oh, you must have lived there.
Sure, maybe we'll, I'll walk you through. Well,
Yeah.
we'll do
Yeah,
it.
okay.
Jill, she did a great job with this house. It's really fun.
I'm sure.
She did. For the rest of you, Barb's house was a more than 100-year-old farmhouse damaged by fire in 2018.
17.
A fire in one room. It didn't burn down, but smoke damage everywhere. And,
That's smoke damage.
they did an extreme makeover. It looks wonderful.
Yeah, so it was fun. Yes, 1889 farmhouse.
Oh,
And,
wow.
our dad and our grandfather were both born in this house.
Oh, my God.
So we are the fourth generation, and the house that Jim and I grew up in, which is, oh, well, out that way,
The,
is where my oldest son lives. He is fifth generation farming with
Oh, my
us.
God.
So,
Fifth generation.
yeah,
Mhm.
we love it here. Are literally grounded in ground.
Literally.
And
Wow.
love it. So,
Fifth generation. Okay.
so Jill, I'll take you on a tour at some point, not today.
okay, all right.
Okay,
That's fair.
it's a great idea.
But I'm
Hey,
so glad to see you. It's so fun to have you in our class.
I know, I love, and Donna and I were talking about that, and Sarah earlier, that it's just, you can gather people from all over.
That's right.
That's great.
Hey, Ashlyn and Mike, glad you joined us.
Yeah, sure. It was good just to listen to what was going on.
Yeah, Ashlyn, was Mike even paying attention?
Yeah, I was. I wrote,
Okay, Mike, glad to have you. Great.
Thank you.
All right, well, we'll see you next week.
Yep.
Bye, guys.
Guys, blessings. Mhm.